Welcome, friends and foes, survivors and killers. Let's sit around the campfire together and talk about Dead by Daylight, specifically the Skull Merchant, and what I would do to change her to make her the strongest and healthiest version of herself in advance of the changes she's recently been confirmed to be getting next year. So, Skull Merchant, the killer so many people love to hate. Not me though, I just love to love her. Anyone who's been around for a little while will know I'm a massive Skull Merchant advocate. I am Adriana's strongest soldier, but I'm not an idiot. I know she's not perfect, and the more I play with her since October, it's become easier for me to put into words why I like the killer so much, and also to understand why a lot of folks don't. Because it's no secret. Skull Merchant is, always has been, and quite probably always will be, Dead by Daylight's most hated killer. Although I'm not going to say she's the least popular, because despite how widely she's despised, she's developed a fairly solid player base. She isn't chronically underplayed like, say, Twins or Hag. There's a lot of complaints about Merchant, and while a good many of them can be roundly summed up as a skill issue, there are two that in my opinion hold the most water, and show why she's so universally despised. Her skill floor, that is the amount of skill required to get basic value out of her power, is lower than it should be. It's not the lowest in the game, she isn't Legion, but she's not that much higher. Play Skull Merchant at the absolute basic bitch level, all you need to do is place a drone in a tile and more or less wait for the lock-on stacks to accumulate. As a survivor will start racking them up just by running the tile. While the beams are avoidable in theory, it's way harder than just placing the drone and then running the tile normally. And you can't eat stacks at a tile for too long before the claw trap sticks to you and you're probably losing a health state. That can make going against her quite frustrating because you get the inevitable sense that you're having to work much harder to stay alive than she's working trying to catch you. And it doesn't help that while this is happening to you, you're being showered with status effects that the killer doesn't really have to work to get, and that you can't reasonably play around in interesting ways. For every survivor tracked on the radar, she gets a dribble of haste, deploying a drone gives her 8 seconds undetectable, and getting scanned while claw trapped hits you with a 10% hinder for 6 seconds. None of these effects are particularly backbreaking on their own. They're all just worse versions of status effects that other killers get. By other killers, I in fact mostly mean Clown. But they add up to an insurmountable advantage where she can just stat check you to death while doing the thing that I said before. Simply wandering around after putting a drone up and waiting for the hit to happen. It's important to remember though, just because the killer has a low skill floor and gets on by a barrage of status effects, doesn't mean that the whole thing needs to be thrown away and started again. Her skill floor might be only slightly above Legion tier, but unlike Legion she has a genuinely interesting and unexplored skill ceiling with a ton of unique skill expression that no other killer can even come close to replicating. If you want to know anything more about this stuff, then I've got a very long video on the topic. Once you really start sinking your teeth into Skull Merchant, there is so much to learn that sets her apart from the other killers, and to obliterate that completely in a full Freddy scale rework would be a betrayal. A robbery of what makes Skull Merchant interesting when it doesn't need to be. There are changes that behaviour can and should make that can preserve or enhance everything interesting about Skull Merchant right now, while addressing many of the concerns players have about her. After drafting a list up, they're mostly not even that complicated. On the 8.1.0 PTB, Knight got a bunch of changes that had two objectives. Making him feel better to play by giving his guards more flexibility and making them all feel distinct, along with raising his frustratingly low skill floor by removing what my friend ZM Pixie lovingly refers to as the shitter guard strategy. I think Knight's mini rework on the PTB is mostly excellent, and a similar scope and scale of changes is in my opinion what Skull Merchant needs when behaviour gets round to changing her next year. So this is what I would suggest. This section is targeted broadly at raising her skill floor, by pushing her away from mindlessly throwing drones at a tile in favour of other, more skill-expressive ways to play her that already exist. The biggest changes here are the adjustments to stealth mode drones, particularly the one that makes stealth mode drones no longer rotate. The thing that makes the wait for hit playstyle so strong right now is the fact that even if the drone is in stealth mode where it's ostensibly less dangerous, the survivor has to play around its constant rotation as they're going round a tile. It's messy, it depends on precise knowledge of how quickly a drone rotates when you might not have that knowledge easily available, and it requires a lot of mental load on the survivor to keep track of while chasing. And during this time, Merchant just put a drone down and carried on from there. Preventing stealth drones from rotating at all would make this a non-issue. You put the drone up and the beam doesn't move, meaning the survivor can easily track where the beam is at any given time and has more room to play around it. Rather than instantly making the whole tile a death trap, it becomes more like Artist, where you're only zoned off of a single part of a tile. Except if Artist's birds could only take a third of a health state at a time rather than potentially a full one. The drone would only start spinning when a survivor trips the laser and puts it into scouting mode, something the survivor is much more easily able to prevent if they don't have to worry about stealth mode spinning. If the Skull Merchant wants her drone to be active in the tile, she'll have to either bait the survivor into walking into it and activating it themselves, or she'll have to laser tag the survivor to manually turn it on, but I'll talk about what that is later. Stealth mode drones not rotating wouldn't just be a nerf to shitting out a drone randomly in a tile though. It would be a direct buff to another playstyle that I've been a big advocate for since her rework. Drones being set up ahead of time and being used as traps. Since her rework hit, Skull Merchant's become a member of Dead by Daylight's very exclusive club of trap killers, but she's been cursed with the slow rotation of stealth mode drones combined with how easy they are to see, meaning that her trapping ability is less consistent than Trapper or Hag. Making stealth mode drones static would fix that. You could choose an angle that you'd want your drone to cover and set it up permanently, monitoring that area until it's disabled. This would reward Skull Merchants who can accurately predict survivor movements and know the tricky little parts of maps where a drone beam can catch someone out. All these little holes and gaps that I talked about in my Skull Merchant guide become completely consistent to use outside of Chase as well as in it, because you can set a drone up to peek through this tiny little gap and it will stay there continuing to peek through until it's activated. With one fell swoop, stealth mode drones not rotating would almost completely kill the most brain-dead way of playing the killer, and allow a Skull Merchant who knows the tricky placements and strategies to benefit more from a trapping playstyle with some really fiendish setups. The obvious comparison to make here is to low power mode. A Skull Merchant add-on prevents drone beams from rotating at all, and I have a love-hate relationship with this add-on. On one hand, the consistency offered by low power mode allowing you to perfectly set up drones makes Merchant way more effective as a proper trap killer. It lets you use all those tricky spots I talked about before with absolute consistency, and the lack of rotation punishes you a lot more for mispositioning a drone. This, in my opinion, is something that should be pushed towards. But the drone permanently staying in the best position it can be in has its own problems. The entire rotation, timing and switching mechanic goes away entirely with this add-on, which lowers her overall skill ceiling, and at some square tiles like Shack, a properly positioned low power mode drone can be even more oppressive than a regular drone, because it will always be in the worst position for survivors to play around it. This is why I suggest low power mode being base kit for stealth mode only, so you can get the best of both worlds. When you're first setting a drone up, the base kit low power mode puts the emphasis on precise placement to get value, makes trapping consistent and punishes you more for mispositioning your drone. But once it's active, the drone becomes less consistent, more dependent on rotation timing to get the same consistent oppressive value in a tile than low power mode gives you for free. Drones not rotating in stealth mode raises her skill floor, but drones not rotating at all lowers her skill ceiling, and if we're looking to make Merchant more skill expressive across the board, I think this is the right way to go about it. The rest of the changes in this section are designed to supplement this idea of ditching the brain-dead playstyle and beefing up the more interactive and skillful ones. These being setting up trap drones, timing drone rotation to catch survivors out at the perfect time, and laser tagging, where you use the perfectly consistent deployment of a drone beam that lines up exactly where you press the power button to nail people with instant lock-on stacks as soon as the drone deploys. Slowing the rotation speed of scouting mode drones, for example, means that drones being active in a tile isn't such a death sentence because the slower beams are a bit easier to play around, and puts the onus on rotating drones at the right time to stack people up, as opposed to letting the drone itself do all the work. The compensation buffs are all targeted to boost these more skill-expressive playstyles in similar ways. Ultrasonic Speaker Base Kit will allow Skull Merchant players who know their rotation timings and can predict survivor movement properly to double stack survivors much more effectively. Removing the yellow hazard ring from stealth drones, unless you're already inside it, means that survivors are punished more for not looking where they're going, and Skull Merchants who could hide their drones in cheeky spots are rewarded more consistently for it, and halving the deployment time would make laser tagging to get that first stack more consistent and realistic. Between the time it takes to put the drone up and for the drone to turn on once it's up, it takes 1.8 seconds for a drone to go from in your pocket to actively scanning, and the lower that time gets, the more consistent accurate laser tagging becomes, because the survivors have less time to react to a drone going up and arming, and you can be more precise when you're aiming it. If drones won't rotate passively anymore, it only makes sense to give the killer more agency in turning that rotation on manually through precise aiming. So that is how scanning survivors should work, at least in my opinion. But once a survivor becomes scanned, we then have another problem on our hands. I spoke earlier about Skull Merchant's free status effects, and they are definitely part and parcel of her low skill floor. Things like her haste and undetectable aren't tools with gameplay and counterplay to them, but just stuff that you get for playing the killer and using your power. Kinda like Billy's Overdrive, but that's a topic for another day. Skull Merchant has 3 primary status effects that create gameplay frustrations: haste, hindered, and undetectable. And when I was writing up these changes, I asked myself, what function did these serve in her kit? Why should they exist? Is there a reason for her to have any of them? So this is what I came up with. The haste to me was the clearest problem to solve. Skull Merchant gets stacking haste for every survivor currently tracked on radar. And I'll make no bones about it, this does not need to exist. It's a relic of her old kit. Behaviour gave Skull Merchant base kit haste back during the olden days of Chess Merchant to attempt to give her a reason to commit to chases sometimes. For some reason she kept it with the rework, and with the newfound lethality that claw traps offer, the killer really doesn't need a reason to commit chases anymore. The Skull Merchant moving at 118% basically permanently, maybe faster if more survivors are scanned, makes playing a chase with her far more awkward than it needs to be. Especially if you're being chased, but your teammate ends up taking a scan from a drone across the map, so you just die because you weren't expecting your dumbass friend to give her a free maid for this. The haste doesn't add anything interesting or skill expressive gameplay-wise to her kit. It just makes her a bit better for no reason at all. I don't think anyone would miss it if it was removed completely and the power redistributed into a more skill expressive place in her kit. Between the haste and hinder making holding a chase a nightmare, the undetectable Merchant gets from deploying a drone is relatively forgettable, but I think it could definitely be improved. Right now, Merchant Undetectable can be awkward to use. You might put a drone up as a trap at the start of the game, or within full view of a survivor, and get undetectable when you really don't need it. But when it actually does get you something, most commonly by hiding your red stain in a chase, it can feel very cheap to be on the receiving end of. Throwing a random drone down in a tile is already free enough without also getting a red stain hidden on top. There's no cost to doing it except putting your power on cooldown, so it's a mechanic that's simultaneously useless 90% of the time it triggers, and is completely free value in chase in the remaining 10% of cases. You might think that, like the haste, I therefore want it gone, but I don't. Dead by Daylight has a tradition of giving stealth tools to killers whose powers don't do a lot if the survivor remains injured. Myers and Ghostface both have stealth to allow them to still be threatening if survivors just stay injured on gens instead of resetting, because the expose that they both depend on doesn't do anything if you're already injured. Even though Ghostface and Myers can insta-down you, it's often a very good idea to reset against them because staying injured against a stealthy killer is very dangerous, and this guarantees their power will always do something, whether or not the survivors heal. Skull Merchant works on the same principle. In theory, the undetectable is the reason you heal against her, even though her power only gets most of its value if you're healthy. Because if you don't heal and she catches you with her stealth, she'll get a free down. Unfortunately, this doesn't work very often in practice though. It usually just becomes another random free chase buff instead, but with one simple change I think we can fix that. Instead of undetectable triggering when you put a drone up, I suggest you get it for the same duration, 8 seconds, when an active drone is recalled instead. This would have 2 major benefits. First, it would allow the Skull Merchant to more actively choose when they get their stealth. You could recall a drone across the map to get undetectable on command without having to put your power on cooldown. Or even chain recalls together on multiple preset drones at once to have long periods without a terror radius. You have more agency to have the undetectable when you actually want it, where you want it. But by tying it specifically to recalling active drones, it also becomes more manageable for the survivors to deal with, because the Skull Merchant has to pay a cost to get her stealth now. She has to recall a drone that she's already set up, and it's a cost that you could actively prevent her from being able to pay. With this change, disabling a drone would not only prevent it from being active, but would also deny the killer their ability to use their undetectable, which would encourage survivors to take the drones down if the Skull Merchant is effectively using her stealth. The killer gets more tools to make a good play, the survivors get more tools to counter them. It's a win-win, really. But the biggest problem to overcome with Merchant status effects is the 10% hindered you get when scanned while claw trapped, because it's simultaneously the most frustrating of them, and also the most required for the killer to function. You could get rid of the haste, you could probably even get rid of the undetectable, and as long as you compensate her properly, the killer would still work. But without some additional effect to boost lethality once a claw trap is applied, there's almost no reason to play her over Plague or Legion at all. Plague gets to keep you permanently injured and get a flamethrower of death if you cleanse her sickness, and Legion can injure an entire team faster than Merchant can get a single injury. A bit of tracking and stealth doesn't really compare to that, so she has to have something like the Hinder to help her out when someone's already claw trapped. But just because she needs something to help her finish a chase, doesn't mean that the way that the Hinder works right now is fine. The Hinder tends to create one of 2 situations. It either gets you a guaranteed hit because the survivor can't make the resource in time, or it forces the survivor to drop the pallet a bit earlier, and that's the end of that. To be fair, sometimes you can use the hinder in a genuinely skill-expressive way by timing the rotation to slap the survivor down with it at exactly the right moment, from exactly the right angle, and I think this is the kind of thing that should be encouraged. Whatever bonus effects you can use should be dependent on timing, extension of the whole rotation timing thing that I talked about earlier. So here's my choice. I've talked about it before. I suggest replacing the hinder with a new effect. Whenever a survivor gets a claw trap or gets scanned while holding a claw trap, that survivor gets led up on killer instinct for 6 seconds. During this time, the Skull Merchant can pull their radar out and use Neuroshock. When Neuroshock is used, the survivor marked by killer instinct is electric shocked by the claw trap and screams. This shock will disable all survivor interactions for 2.5 seconds, the same as the disable that Doctor gets off of his shock therapy attack. Neuroshock expends 1 pip of the claw trap battery every time it's used, meaning that the killer has got 3 shocks before the claw trap falls off. The idea here is to make a chase tool that's harder to get effective value out of than the hinder, while also being more useful than the hinder when it's used at the right time. I think a Doctor Shock controllable from the radar after a survivor is scanned is the perfect tool. Disabling survivor actions has utility at every tile in the game, and could allow the merchant to remove the survivor's options at the perfect moment to secure that down. But since the survivor doesn't lose any distance, and they only have at most 3 attempts before the claw trap falls off, they have to time it right if they want it to be effective. To me, this is the perfect solution to Merchant's lethality problem, and despite being the most design intensive part of my suggested changes, I think it would be worth the effort to at least give it a go. They did say they had bigger changes planned for her next year. Maybe this is the kind of thing we should expect. God, I really hope it is. The only other things I'd do would be quality of life and polish stuff. Things like making a clear sound cue that plays when a drone gets rotated, fixing her bugs because she has plenty of them, and taking a pass on her add-ons because they desperately need an update. Here's my list of reworked add-ons if you're at all interested, and here's a list of potential buffs I would give if the version of Merchant presented in this video was to come to live servers and was later found to be too weak. She wouldn't need all of these, she might not even need any of these, but this is a list of areas of her kit that could be buffed if she turned out to be weaker than she needed to be. I know to some folks watching this video, the changes I suggest here won't be radical enough. A lot of people more or less want Skull Merchant deleted and replaced with a whole new killer. And to those people I say, no. Last time we got a killer deleted and replaced with a new one, we had the Twins rework. Hands down the worst rework in Dead by Daylight history. We should know by now that preserving the original character as much as possible while addressing the kit's issues is the key to a good rework. Look at Doctor, or Leatherface, or Legion. They all got fantastic reworks because behaviour didn't just know what to throw away, but also what to save. A great example is something I hear folks complain about a lot. Tons of people tell me that you should be able to remove lock-on stacks from yourself as survivor, or that disabling Merchant's drones should break them permanently, or send them back to her or something until she comes over and puts them back. And this sounds alright on paper, until you think about it for a little bit and realise this would not have the result you wanted. Say you could remove stacks. Say taking a drone out removed a lock-on stack. Then suddenly the entire trapping playstyle of Merchant, all the knowledge of where to set up your drones, stops being relevant. Because now even if the survivor messes up and steps onto a drone, the lock-on stack they gained off it would immediately be removed again. They made a mistake and weren't even slightly punished for it. Your drones would be totally useless outside of chase. In fact, possibly even worse than useless, because then anybody who finds themselves with a stack can just run up to an out of chase drone and take it out. Here's how Merchant would play in that case. She puts a drone down in the tile, she zones you with it like she does now, and then recalls the drone again when you leave the tile. That's it. That would be the entire gameplay. And you'd need to buff that playstyle too, so forget about removing the haste or nerfing the spin speed or whatever. If you're getting rid of the trapping playstyle, you've got to buff the traditional zoning playstyle, and that is a much more dangerous thing to buff. And the same thing goes for making disabling drones permanent. Trapper and Hag are both pretty shit killers, because they have to spend so much time maintaining their trap setups, and they have more traps that are harder to see and are either free hits or free downs if you step on one. Making Skull Merchant have to invest the same amount of time that Trapper and Hag have to maintain her drone setups would require massively buffing her in other areas to make up for that loss in power. And something tells me that a buff on that level, like for example letting drones down you by themselves as compensation for a massive nerf like that, would not go down well. It's things like this, innocuous comments or strange ideas from people I see out there in the wild that just wouldn't work in practice, that would have consequences that only a Skull Merchant player can see, that worry me so much about the future of this killer. For every person I can meet in the middle with a legitimate issue, there's another who's misdiagnosing a problem, or flat out inventing one because they don't understand the killer. I see it all the time online, and it's so exhausting because no matter what I do, it's like people don't want to understand. They just want to yell and yell until behaviour gives them something new to yell at. Between a dev team with a history of mishandling the reworks of unique killers, and a community that's baying for her blood, my faith in the Skull Merchant rework coming next year is limited to say the least. That's why this video exists. I intend to cut through the noise and make my voice heard, because the merchant changes are likely still in their early days. If behaviour catches wind of this video, there may be time for my feedback to be taken into account before it leaves the drawing board. If anyone at Behaviour working on merchants' future changes watching this video right now, please reach out to me. I'd love to talk with you, because any feedback I can give, anything constructive I can do to help out, I'll happily do it, because this killer means a lot to me. She's the most fun I've ever had playing Dead by Daylight. After what happened to the twins with their rework so bad it almost broke the killer completely, I'm not letting go of my new favourite killer without a fight.